This week, we're approaching 6 months of Russia's war in Ukraine and, by extension, 6 months of the Ukrainian refugee crisis. So I talk with Mariia Hershova, a 23-year-old Ukrainian Jew helping refugees in Poland, about how the refugee situation has evolved and the pride of Ukrainian Jewry. I'm Lev Gringauz, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. If you like this podcast or Jewfolk generally and the work that we do, support us by buying our merch. All the classics are there, 10,000 Ways to be Jewish designs, The Jews Are Tired mugs and shirts, and just a plain TC Jewfolk logo on stuff if that's what you're into. A link to the store is in the podcast notes, so go take a look, and there's also a link to donate to Jewfolk in the podcast notes if you want to give directly. We appreciate any support you can give. Also, if you want to subscribe to our weekly TC Jewfolk newsletter for all the local Minnesota Jewish news, or our monthly podcast newsletter where you can get updates on all our podcasts, go to tcjewfolk.com and hit that subscribe button at the top of the screen. We've got some new projects in the pipeline that you won't want to miss. As of the release of this podcast, it's day 162 of Russia's war in Ukraine. If you want to donate to help Ukraine, there's a link in the podcast notes with resources to do that. Okay, on to the main focus of this episode. I wanted to talk to Hershova for a couple of reasons. First of all, she's a Ukrainian Jew who was living in Poland before the war started, who has been working with the Jewish Community Center and Hillel of Krakow to help Ukrainian refugees. Not just Jewish refugees, but any and all Ukrainian refugees, which the entire Polish Jewish community has been working to help. So she's obviously got some stories to tell about refugees and how she's personally doing in the midst of all of this. Already interesting, I think. Second of all, we're reaching a point where public attention to Ukraine and the refugee crisis is, I think, starting to slip. There was a lot of attention in the first few weeks when there was a, massive movement of Ukrainians displaced in Ukraine and fleeing to other countries. You've probably seen photos of Ukrainians crossing international borders into Poland, Hungary, Romania, and other countries. And especially as the Jewish community has been involved in fundraising for aid, with some Jewish organizations helping refugees directly, there are a lot of photos of American Jewish leaders visiting the Polish border to see the flow of people. But nowadays, there's a lot less movement over borders and a very different kind of aid that is taking place: long-term refugee resettlement. It's the kind of work that, to put it bluntly, isn't sexy. Desperate people crossing borders, fleeing for their lives is a much more compelling media image than those same people, months later, trying to find apartments, get their kids in school, learn a new language, and get stable jobs. But this is also a kind of refugee aid that takes a lot more effort to do successfully and requires a lot more funding to support, which means it requires more attention, not less. So here's me trying to use this podcast as a platform to keep attention and awareness up. And yes, I'll admit to personal bias here as my mom is from Ukraine, so I obviously want to keep talking about this. But I also think, albeit in a really unfortunate kind of way, that this is a great opportunity to learn more about the resilience and pride of the Ukrainian Jewish community. That's particularly important for American Jews who, coming from perhaps the strongest and most influential Jewish community in the world, sometimes patronizingly look down at other Jewish communities, especially communities in Eastern Europe that we're sort of used to hearing about as helpless post-Soviet know-nothings, when a lot has changed since the 1990s. So Hershova and I cover a lot of ground in this interview, and I hope you find it interesting, and I think you'll find it inspiring as well in ways that you might not expect. Not everything is doom and gloom, even in these difficult times. I've put links in the podcast notes to a poll of antisemitism in Eastern Europe, which is referenced in this conversation, as well as links to donate to the Hillel and JCC of Krakow if you want to give directly to them. In case you're interested, I'll also throw in links to some of my reporting. One story about anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and another about American Jewish mission trips to Poland and how that affects Polish Jewish refugee aid. This conversation has been lightly edited for length and clarity, and there is some background noise from my cat, so please excuse me. Enjoy. Let's start with the current situation. So at the moment you're in Portugal, but you live in Krakow, working with the JCC and the Hillel there to help Ukrainian refugees fleeing the Russian invasion. How did you get involved with refugee aid, and what have you seen and experienced as you've been helping refugees?
That's a great question because, of course, each and every Ukrainian that I know, when the war started 24th February morning, everyone got a message from their family or they experienced it themselves. The war started. So obviously people who were already abroad, and I have been living in Poland for the last 5 years, they wanted to help as much as they can. And the most natural decision was to join an organization. And the majority of Ukrainians of Krakow did that. So I'm not a unique example. Majority of Ukrainians just joined an organization. I picked JCC because they were helping Ukrainian refugees a lot, and I was already a member. So it felt very natural to join your own community that was helping Ukrainian refugees. How beautiful. So this is how I started. It was very natural, I would say. I have been helping refugees to find the most basic things: legal aid, help with accommodation, help with getting their kids to school, help where to eat, and this kind of, this basic things that a person who just came to a random city wants to know where to find. So I would just be a translator or help them to find these necessities. At first, I was a volunteer at a train station, a very important place where people would come and they don't know the language, they don't know the culture, they need someone to guide them through. And then I moved to a NGO center where I would just consult people on where they should go or what they should be doing in order to find a job or find whatever they need.
Do you have any specific stories to tell of, the refugees that you were helping out, or some of the stories that you encountered as you were doing this work?
Yeah, especially if it's about Jewish people. This podcast is about Jewish people. I would rather tell a Jewish story. I had a beautiful story. So a couple months ago, a woman comes up to me and she's like, hello, my name is Elena. I'm from Ukraine. I'm Ukrainian, but my husband is Jewish. And he doesn't want to admit it. I was like, okay, that sounds fun. So tell me more. And she's like, well, the lost generation, Soviet Union, the people who were in denial about their Jewishness or whatever, they want to be Jewish or not. They didn't know. So my husband is Jewish, I suppose. And the first thing I would ask, what is his surname? And she said, Zipperstein. And I was like, okay, he probably is Jewish. And I was like, okay, bring him over. So she brought her husband, and her husband was such a shy, an amazing man, very smart, very active. And he's like around 75 years old. And I gave him a tour in Kazimierz and told him what it is to be Jewish, because he was very afraid to join a community, and asked him why. And he said, because I don't speak Hebrew. And I felt this warmth in my heart. And I felt like I could, show this man what is being Jewish about. So I took him to the center, gave him a tour all over Kazimierz, because I have been a Jewish tour guide for 5 years now. And I told him everything about Jewishness and Jewish stories and how to be Jewish. I showed him what does it mean to have a Shabbat, how to bake challah. And he was just mesmerized and amazed by everything that I showed. And he was like, yes, I really want to be Jewish after that. So this is one of these beautiful stories that you face every day, just helping people not only to find accommodation, but to find who they are.
That really is amazing. Can you also say, for people who don't understand sort of what the Polish Jewish community has been doing to help refugees, can you explain a little bit more about sort of what the structure is, what that help actually looks like?
Firstly, we need to understand that there's a religious Jewish community of Krakow, and there's JCC Krakow, which is a non-religious organization that is aimed to bring culture and awareness about core Jewish people, right? So we're a non-religious organization. And of course, we have donors all over the world who want to support this Jewish life, who want to support this, cultural awareness in Poland and in Krakow. And when the war started, the head of JCC, Jonathan, he said, okay, now our new goal is to help Ukrainian refugee, whatever this refugee is, Muslim, Jewish. For example, we are helping Roma people of Ukraine. We're helping Jewish, non-Jewish people. It doesn't matter. It did not matter, and it doesn't matter now. So we provide a lot of services right now, thanks to, of course, our supporters from all over the world. Everyone can join in their support. Just saying, just saying. We provide meals, we provide accommodation, we provide classes of Polish and English. We provide a mother's room where mothers and kids can come and just chill and relax. We provide different classes for kids where they can paint and learn new stuff. So there's a big variety of things that JCC Krakow does. But of course, the main one would stay in accommodation, of course, because of course it requires big amount of money and requires an effort. And we're co-working with some organization on that. And we provide accommodation for the refugees and meals for refugees. And also to sum up, we also have this amazing free of charge shop where refugees can shop and get shampoos and soaps and all this first things that you need when you just came to a new city and you're just, settling down here and you need first basic things.
So at the beginning of the war, there was a lot of focus on sort of the border and the big sort of movement of refugees into different countries like Poland. My understanding now is that there's a lot less movement sort of between different areas now and more so focus on long-term refugee resettlement efforts in places like Poland. Can you talk about that transition in the aid process of like helping people who are just sort of moving out and fleeing as opposed to the long-term, the situation for refugees and what that's like in Krakow 5 months into the war, almost 6?
So, of course, our help has changed. Has changed a lot this month, for example, in July specifically. Because before we would have not only JCC Krakow, but the majority of organization would be focused on providing food, hot meals, this first basic stuff for people, accommodation. Now we're focused, of course, we're also focused on these things, but moreover to that, we're focused on providing long-term support, finding a job, finding accommodation for long-term, giving lectures on Polish language and English language so people could find good jobs and could, understand what they're going to do in this country, understand what's their future like in this country, because it does not look like Russia is going to stop the war tomorrow, unfortunately. So right now, JCC and the majority of organizations focused on helping people to settle down. And this, of course, requires knowledge of the languages, finding a job, finding accommodation. So these are 3 main things. And of course, for people with kids is to support these kids when finding a school. September starts very soon. Of course, a lot of Ukrainian refugees, their kids decided to stay in Ukrainian schools. And for that, they are doing online education. But some people decided that their kids, it's better if they start, understanding how's it to live in Poland. And they started to try to give their kids to Polish schools. And this is also a big thing that a majority of organizations are supporting the refugees with now.
I also want to back up a moment because you are a Ukrainian Jew, and I remember you telling me that you were 15 when Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014. So how are you feeling in all this? Like, what's it like having, unfortunately, so much of your life defined by Russian aggression?
It's been tough because, for that, we need to understand the context of how Russia affected Ukraine all over centuries, not only this last years. And we need to say that, unfortunately, Russia did not start the first war in 2014. It was not the first war. Each century, there is one new war, one new genocide, unfortunately. And this is how it has been going. So when I was a child in school, they would tell us about, for example, 1930s and Holodomor, the genocide of ethnic Ukrainians that Soviet government with, of course, the capital in Moscow, did to Ukrainians. And you were raised in the stories of your neighbors and stories of your Jewish grandmas and grandpas would also tell, hey, when we were younger, we would go outside and we would hear Ukrainian language everywhere, where it's not like this anymore because unfortunately, majority of ethnic Ukrainians were just murdered in 1930s. And you could not really, continue with this, especially Ukrainian culture and Jewish Ukrainian culture. So growing up, I already felt like something new is coming. It's just inevitable, unfortunately, because, history is very, very much like a circle. So it has to come back one day. So when 2014 came and the war started and Crimea was occupied, unfortunately, my dad was not surprised because since the very early childhood, he has been telling me about that it might come any day. So we just started to be Ukrainian Jews all over again and just, help our people because, okay, each Jewish person decides whatever their homeland is. For me, my homeland is Ukraine. As much as I adore and love and respect Israel and I have a big family there, my homeland is Ukraine. This is not a question for me. So you decide to help your people and stay and be as useful as you can wherever you are. And actually, a lot of Ukrainian Jews have been like this since the start of the war. So I'm not the only one. And there's nothing special about it because Ukrainian Jews are Ukrainians. This is it. And there's something beautiful about it because there's this unique Ukrainian Jewish culture. And if you ask me a question, I would love to answer about it. But this is my simple question. So living under Russian aggression for so many years, it has become a normal everyday thing, unfortunately, fighting on both internet and physically, mentally. Every day you wake up and you're thinking, okay, what's going to be next? What they going to say today? What they going to do today? Who they going to kill today? Majority of my classmates, and I am very young. I'm 23, I'm young. My classmates are at war and I'm sending them ammunition and first aid kits. This should not be like this. It should not be like that. But this is normality for us.
Since you brought it up, what else do you want to say about the Ukrainian Jewish community? Since you were like, ask me a question. So what's the,
Ask me a question. There's so much to tell because Ukraine has a unique Jewish community, actually the third largest in Europe. And we have actually two pretty unique Jewish communities because, okay, whenever we think about Ukrainian Jews, people would probably assume, well, Ashkenazi Jews, who else? And I even remember when I went to Birthright to Israel, we had out of 30 people from Odessa and Dnipro, where I'm from, we had one Sephardic Jew. And we were all so excited because it was something absolutely insane. But we have two more pretty unique ethno-religious communities with our Korean Jewish people, ethnic to Crimean region, and also Krimchaks, Jewish people that are indigenous to Crimea. And this is pretty awesome because not any other country has it, only Ukraine. And we really want to, talk about these communities and preserve them. And unfortunately, a couple of months ago, a majority of Korean synagogues in Kharkiv was bombed by Russian invasion. So this is why I want to really focus on the Russian invasion because it's not only killing Ashkenazi Jewish culture, but this indigenous Jewish cultures that only Ukraine has. Only Ukraine has. And we as Jewish people of planet Earth, we need to think about it daily because this culture is just going to go instinct and we need to take an action to preserve them. That's what I want to say.
Oh, and to go back a moment also, can you say a little bit how you ended up in Poland? Sort of what's the journey there?
Yeah, absolutely. So 5 years ago, around 5.5, I decided that I wanted to study international relations. And I thought maybe going abroad would be nice. And then my dad, he's a big fan of Isaac Asimov and Stanislav Lem, who both are Jewish people and created history, pretty famous writers. So when he found out that Stanislav Lem, who was born in Lviv, he is a Jew, Polish Jew. He was studying in Jagiellonian University. When he found it out, he was like, you're going there. Stanislav Lem was studying in Jagiellonian. You must study there too. And for him, this is interesting because with this lost generation and Soviet Union trying to kill Jewish culture and Jewishness at itself, it's very interesting because my dad, his father, his mother would always tell him to forget about his Jewishness and stuff like that to, save your life, save your future because they themselves, faced so much anti-Semitism, so much. And then him just being unknowingly Jewish is the most amazing thing ever. Reading Jewish people, following Jewish people, just doing Jewish things without even knowing that these are Jewish things. This is the most amazing phenomenon in this lost generation culture, I would say. Even though I have to teach my dad what is Shabbat and what is Rosh Hashanah or how to be Jewish or, what is Yiddish, even though I have to teach him, he does a lot of things that are unknowingly Jewish. This is very specific for Ukraine, I would say.
So when you and I last talked, it was about American Jewish mission trips that were coming to Poland to see the refugee crisis and sometimes to volunteer. And something you brought up was that you would sometimes argue with the American Jews about anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Can you explain sort of what that disagreement was, but most importantly, what it tells you about how lots of Americans and Jews think about Ukraine?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the most amazing topics ever, because whenever I talk to people, I feel like no one knows what they're talking about, but they're very passionate about it. So as a Ukrainian Jew, I'm always here to guard my ideas, my values and principles and my culture by the end of the day, because I was raised and breathed by Ukraine and Ukrainian Jews. So to start with, I feel like it's important to mention that Ukraine has not the highest level of anti-Semitism in Europe. Which is an interesting notion, because the majority of people, whenever I talk about them, they're very passionate about this idea that Ukraine is like the biggest evil to Jewish people in Europe, which is very interesting to me. And it's not. The level of anti-Semitism actually not the highest in Europe. It's actually not even top 3. It's actually higher in Poland than in Ukraine, which is very interesting because, well, if you hear about European Union, you would think that maybe the situation would have been improved, but not. France is our leader still. Of course, it does not mean that we do not have anti-Semitic slurs. We do not have anti-Semitic attacks. We only have one physical attack, anti-Semitic physical attack since 2018. Of course, it is incredibly bad. But if we have 42 million people, it's pretty good by the end of the day. We have to look at the data. We have to compare. We have to understand. We have a specific also organization who is looking after this kind of anti-Semitic attacks, anti-Semitic slurs, anti-Semitism in general, and is tracking that anti-Semitism. And it is not highest in Europe. Trust me, this is not. And everyone can actually follow that organization. You just need to go to Ukrainian English-speaking Wikipedia about anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and you can easily find their page and track it by yourself. So you can check it by yourself. And actually, a couple of days ago, a friend of mine who is a big supporter of the Ukrainian army and a Jewish person herself, who moved to the United States when she was 17 years old, has been living in the United States majority of her life. And we connected because she's from Kharkiv herself, and she's just an amazing woman. And she's like, okay, I'm giving an interview to an American newspaper in a couple of days about anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Could you please ask, let's say, 20 of your friends about anti-Semitic attacks? And let's see what's going to come out of it. Of course, we're going to use the official data, but I want some, more stories from, normal, everyday people, friends, real people. So I asked 20 of my friends, and I decided to pick friends from different cities because, of course, Jews in Ukraine live in completely different cities, and they can be in any city, any village. So I asked 20 of my friends, and none of them told them that they ever experienced anti-Semitism. Only 2 of them said that they had some maybe light anti-Semitic slurs, but they said, it did not really affect my life in any way, even though it was bad. But, I fixed it at the end of the day. It was nothing really that was too horrible, I would say. So I think it's a pretty good result. I would think it's a pretty good result. I myself experienced a anti-Semitic attack only in Poland when I moved to Poland. But I got to tell you that the city I'm coming from is pretty Jewish. So it's the second most Jewish city in Ukraine. It has over 60,000 Jews in it, and the biggest Jewish center in the world. So I would say it's pretty hard to be anti-Semitic there. People are going to find you after that. So I would say people who are talking about neo-Nazism, for example, or anti-Semitism in Ukraine, of course, this is a valid conversation. We have to bring it up, especially as Jewish people, because we experienced so much horrible genocides and attacks in past and still are experiencing them. We have to bring it up in order to prevent it, of course. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of people who are entering this conversation, they just do not understand the context. I'm sorry for being rough, but this is it.
Believe me, you don't need to apologize. It's all good. It's exactly why I'm asking. So I also wanted to ask, have you noticed or are you worried about global attention and aid moving on from Ukrainian refugees? Sort of tying back to our previous sort of conversation about where the situation is now.
Since the start of the war, I have been very much afraid about whataboutism. Whataboutism is when someone tries to bring attention to Ukraine and to helping Ukraine. Well, maybe not even specifically refugees, but helping Ukrainian army, helping Ukrainian refugees, whatever you want to help. And people are like, but how about, or what about this? But what about this? This is not good, in my opinion, because, okay, even before the war in Ukraine, which was when I was like 14 years old, of course, I understand that there are a lot of problems out there. But we also need to understand that Russia brought the biggest refugee crisis of 21st century. So the scale is pretty big. And by turning attention from biggest refugee crisis in Europe right now, that's, pretty concerning to me at least. But who am I to judge? Once again, this is just a personal opinion.
So what's the most important thing you want listeners and I guess American Jews more broadly to know right now about Ukraine, refugees, and the war?
Of course, number one is there's no negotiation with terrorists. This might sound controversial to you, but unfortunately, as our experience showed as both Ukrainian and Jewish person, there was never a negotiation with Russia. And I am a graduate of international relations, so I think I have a right to talk about this. But recent negotiations, I would say in peaceful agreement between Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine about Ukraine being allowed to sell grain again to different countries and to get economy back on track did not work. And it never, any negotiations with Russia, they never worked. Russia does not need your negotiations. There was such a saying, I would say, I don't remember the author, but if you're trying to play by the rules, but your opponent never cared about rules, guess who's going to win by the end? So we need to understand we need to keep on supporting Ukraine no matter what, no matter what's happening. We need to support Ukrainian army. We need to support Ukrainian refugees. I think that has been a very big discussion, especially among Americans right now, about supporting how controversial it might be to support the Ukrainian army. It is not controversial. There are a lot of even Jewish people in Ukrainian army who unfortunately have already died, murdered by Russia. And we need to understand that supporting them is not controversial. There's nothing controversial about people who decided to support their home. And there was the only way for them to do that. So we have this hashtag and this movement, Arm Ukraine Now. So if I could only convey one message right now to the people who are listening to me, that would be Arm Ukraine Now. That's it. Nothing else. Simple and quick.
Yeah, and it should be noted just for listeners for a sort of a broader view, it's not new that Russia doesn't abide by rules or by agreements. Russia has a long track record in Syria and many other previous conflicts dating back to the Soviet Union of just they make agreements to fake out politically and to win points, and then they go in and do whatever they want anyway. So it's a very, very difficult, you can't trust when you're negotiating with Russia. You just can't. So for the longer view on that.
Yes, thank you. And I would want to add on this because a lot of people, and I understand why they do this, but a lot of people think it's only Russian government. But unfortunately, a lot of Ukrainians, let me tell you, a lot of Ukrainians have relatives in Russia, which is normal. Neighboring countries, that's a normal thing. And of course, in the Soviet Union, there was like a one country, no borders. So a lot of people moved around. So we do have a lot of relatives. And as Jewish Ukrainian person, of course, you have a connection with Russian Jewish communities as well. And I'm not going to say myself because there would be too much of a biased personal opinion. I'm going to just quote a main Ukrainian rabbi, the rabbi of Kyiv right now, who said that he was very disappointed that Russian community did nothing to support the Ukrainian community. They did not speak out. No one did any posts. No one texted privately to say, oh my God, I'm so sorry for what's happening. This is what he was saying. He was very disappointed, and he encouraged Russian Jews to speak out and to support their fellow Jewish people, their neighbors. And so we have been very, very disappointed in the reaction of Russian Jews. And I know that a lot of American Russian Jews, they supported us, but this is different because they are Americans now. So of course, they can do this, and that's great. But we've been very, very sad about that. I think it's very important to mention because we really counted on their support, and we really counted on them, sticking out or at least doing something.
So the last question I have for you is, how are you holding on to your sense of humor and hope as the situation continues? Is there something you hold on to in particular that stops you from falling into total despair over what's going on?
Yes, it's my father. Because my father, my brother, and my whole family is back in Dnipro. And, they're getting bombed every day, constantly. Constantly, whenever I'm calling, my dad is hiding from Russian bombings. And this is completely insane. This is a different reality because I never expected this to happen. When the war started, I always thought that it would be maybe eastern part of Ukraine. And what is keeping me alive is just knowing that my dad is alive today. So I'm trying to focus on this very moment and not be overwhelmed by what the future might bring to me. I'm just keep on telling myself, he's alive today and we're good. Today we're good. So this is what gives me hope. Also, what gives me hope is speaking out and talking about Ukrainian Jewish culture, the place of where Hasidism and Babka was created. So I just want people to know about that there is Ukrainian Jewish culture, that there is no just, this Eastern European, Russian Jewish culture, or whatever. There is unique Ukrainian Jewish culture, and I am the person who represents it. I cannot give up. I gotta tell people what this is about. I don't want it to be forgotten, and I don't want it to be dead. So these two things really keep me going, every day, that I am this alive descendant of this amazing Ukrainian Jews who fought before and they are fighting now. That's it.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news, stories, or reports referenced for this episode.